Hello and welcome to another episode of A Brief History. Today's episode, Metroid. Ready, set, go!
August 6th, 1986. With the gaming industry having been greatly rejuvenated thanks to the Nintendo Entertainment System and revolutionary titles like Super Mario Bros. And Legend of Zelda, Nintendo wasn't just the biggest name in the industry, they essentially were the industry. And with their popularity and critical acclaim higher than any home console predecessor, Nintendo kept themselves on track by continuously releasing even more revolutionary software. But among the Marios, Pac-Man, Zeldas, and Clues stood a grand outlier. This game was dark and unsettling in a library full of bright, cheery titles, and it was simply known as Metroid.
Produced by the late Gunpei Yokoi and developed by Nintendo's R&D1 division and Intelligent Systems, Metroid was a side-scrolling action platforming game that featured a hardened, stoic protagonist named Samus Aran, who, much to the shock of NES owners back in the day, was eventually revealed to be a female. Armed with an upgradable spacesuit and an arm cannon, Samus's job, and therefore your job, was to navigate through the foreboding catacombs of the alien-infested planet Zebes in order to stop the evil space pirates from using a species of dangerous, life-draining organisms known as Metroids to destroy all who oppose them.
In a time when story didn't really matter all that much in video games, I'm looking at you, Blaster Master. I mean, seriously, chasing after a frog, that's just absurd. Metroid took that notion and blew it away with a super missile. Cue super missile graphic. Excellent. Metroid's unique style and hybrid Mario and Zelda gameplay made it a massive success on the NES, shipping 2.73 million units worldwide, despite the absurdly long password system. Capital S, lowercase h, capital L, maybe a 1, could be a 1, 0, capital O, maybe O. Oh, seriously, these passwords suck.
Matt? You okay? You need some water or something? We got Pepto if you need it.
I mean, come on! Who thought these passwords were a good idea? Look at this! What does this even mean? How is anyone supposed to remember this?
Okay, moving on. Since its original release, Metroid has also been ported to several other game consoles, such as the Game Boy Advance, the Wii and 3DS Virtual Console, and it even saw an enhanced remake on the Game Boy Advance known as Metroid Zero Mission. So Nintendo fans were obviously eager for a Metroid sequel, and Nintendo were happy to oblige. However, they made a slightly bizarre decision in regards to this follow-up.
In 1991, 5 years after the original Metroid, Nintendo released Metroid II Return of Samus. It's Roman numeral for 2, look it up. Not for the NES, not for the Super Nintendo, but for the Nintendo Game Boy, which, fun fact, was created by Metroid producer Gunpei Yokoi. Clearly a case of favoritism if I've ever heard one. While not quite as well received as its home console predecessor, Metroid II still maintained the same ominous feel and gameplay as the original, and received mostly positive reviews from fans and critics alike. But despite all this, fans were still greatly anticipating a new home console installment to the series, and on April 18th, 1994, Nintendo granted their wishes with the Super Nintendo classic, Super Metroid.
Super Metroid expanded and refined everything that fans loved about the first two games while adding in new weapons, masterful music, and mind-blowing graphics that hold up perfectly to this day. Super Metroid was an incredible hit on the SNES, receiving near-perfect scores from critics, and it has since become a fan favorite, placing highly on multiple lists of the best games of all time.
Can I just say, I love Super Metroid, and I love Nintendo, but I am so glad Nintendo dropped the whole trend of adding their console names to the end of the game titles. You know what I'm talking about. Super Metroid for the Super Nintendo, Donkey Kong 64 for the N64, New Super Mario Bros. Wii for the... I guess some habits die hard. But speaking of the N64, after the utter critical hit that was Super Metroid, the series hit a bit of a bump in the road. Despite the first 3 games in the series receiving extremely positive reviews and selling very well, the sales numbers just couldn't compare to those of Mario or Zelda. This prompted Nintendo to essentially shelve the Metroid franchise throughout the entirety of the N64's lifespan. The closest Samus ever came to showing up on Nintendo's first 3D console was her appearance in Super Smash Bros.
So things were looking pretty bleak for Metroid fans. The series had been completely absent for 8 long years. Until finally on November 17th, 2002, Nintendo made up for this octacular absence with not just 1, but 2 brand new Metroid titles. The first of these titles being Metroid Fusion for the Game Boy Advance, and the second being Metroid Prime for the Nintendo GameCube. Metroid Prime was a very special yet peculiar game. Where Fusion was developed by the R&D1 division and featured the same side-scrolling gameplay as the first 3 titles, Prime was tackled by the Texas-based developer Retro Studios and featured a new twist on Metroid's signature gameplay mechanic. Being released for the GameCube, Prime was the very first fully 3D Metroid game, but instead of it taking place from a third-person perspective a la Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, Retro Studios decided that their Metroid reboot should be a first-person adventure game.
This choice was a bit polarizing among Metroid fans, many worrying that Metroid would become something along the lines of a Halo clone, losing what made the original game so great. However, Prime was meticulously faithful to the isolated adventure gameplay of the original series, and it soon won over many of its skeptics who realized that the first-person viewpoint actually enhanced what made the original game so great.
Metroid Prime went on to become one of the best-selling games of 2002 and eventually spawned 2 sequels. One released for the GameCube in 2004, subtitled Echo, Echoes, and another for the Nintendo Wii in 2007 subtitled Corruption. Echoes was a much darker and more difficult spin on its predecessor, and Corruption expanded on the template of Prime, giving Samus multiple planets to explore instead of just one. These sequels were both incredibly successful, and along with the original, they are highly regarded as some of Nintendo's greatest achievements. In fact, in 2009, all 3 Prime games were re-released in a collection pack for the Nintendo Wii, utilizing the Corruption control scheme.
So Nintendo and Retro Studios had successfully capped off one of the most successful video game trilogies of the 21st century, which of course is a bittersweet accomplishment. How do you follow up on such universally loved games? Well, with Retro Studios having moved on to reboot yet another well-known Nintendo franchise, Nintendo decided to team up with the developers Team Ninja and D-Rockets to once again switch up the Metroid formula. What resulted was the incredibly cinematic and story-driven Metroid Other M, released for the Nintendo Wii on August 31st, 2010.
Other M came as a bit of a shock to Metroid fans as the game no longer took place in first person. Rather, Other M went for an interesting hybrid of perspective. There were traditional side-scrolling segments in the vein of Super Metroid, other sections took place in the aforementioned Mario 64 Ocarina of Time third-person perspective, and of course, players could at any time switch to first person to perform certain tasks, but while in this mode, the player could no longer move. This hybrid of gameplay mechanics mixed with the game's deep, personal, and cinematic narrative all made Other M a very unique, yet once again, polarizing game.
But this time it wasn't the gameplay that made it polarizing, it was the game's interpretation of Samus's character. It was the first game to give this silent protagonist a voice, and what fans got were lengthy monologues in a monotone voice and a storyline that had one of gaming's strongest female heroines underpower herself unnecessarily based on the commands of a man. After decades of waiting to see this character get fully fleshed out, people were, well, let's just say they were disappointed. Reviews were mixed to positive, and the sales of the game failed to meet Nintendo's expectations.
Now, none of this information is meant to imply that the game was terrible. On the contrary, Other M was a very daring and unique game that wasn't content on just mooching off the success of its predecessor. But as we've come to learn, change does not always yield a positive fan response, whether those changes be in gameplay or in character. And when you get right down to it, video games are a subjective medium, just like all other forms of entertainment. No one can please everyone, but it's always important to try new things. Sometimes those things work, and sometimes they fail, and when those inevitable failures happen, the only thing you can do is get back up and start again.
But this recovery process appears to have been more difficult for Nintendo than expected, for we have yet to see a new entrant to the Metroid series since Other M's release in 2010. Despite all that, there is absolutely no denying the impact that these games have had on not only their respective consoles, but the industry in general.
Nintendo obviously cares deeply about making the Metroid games as special as they can be. Unlike Mario and Sonic, you rarely see Metroid saturated into a million spin-offs. In fact, after almost 3 decades, Metroid has really only ever seen 2 spin-off games. 2005's Metroid Pinball and 2006's Metroid Prime Hunters, both for the Nintendo DS. So Nintendo was obviously very careful about how they treat the Metroid franchise, keeping gameplay consistent while also innovating and switching things up every few years.
In this day and age of the gaming industry, it's very rare to see a series handled with this much care and exclusivity, which has helped the Metroid series gain massive success without ever having to sacrifice gameplay for accessibility. And perhaps that's what makes the series so beloved amongst gamers. Both Metroid and Nintendo have struggled through some seriously difficult times recently, but I know for certain that someday soon they'll both bounce back stronger than ever. Thanks for watching, guys. DFTBA.
Super Metroid was an incredible hit on the SNES, receiving near-perfect scores from critics, and it has since become a fan favorite, placing highly on multiple lists of the best games of all time. Or should I say, the best games of all time. Oh yeah, that sounds much better.